Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. A key value of mine with this podcast is to not only include diverse voices, but to elevate the diverse voices that have largely been left out of the conversation around masculinity. And for me, that value has become an imperative to match the intensity of the political, social, and health crises we face today. That's why I feel really honored that my next guest said yes when I asked him to be a part of the New Masculine. Meridian Mayer identifies as a brother, as a lover, and as a husband. For context, Meridian is a Black man, adopted and socialized by a white family, who is navigating the intersectionality of his identities in a time of acute conversations and systemic change around race and racism in the US. On top of that, he has been on a transformational journey with his own gender identity. As a result of the complexity and the diversity of his life experiences, Meridian is confronting what it means to be a man in ways many men will never have to. And that is what really draws me to wanting to deepen my relationship with Meridian. And I'm thrilled he agreed to share that process here with all the listeners. So let's get into it. Welcome, Meridian.
Thanks, Travis. I'm happy to be here.
It's very nice to have you here. And as I said in my intro, I'm super grateful you said yes to this when I reached out to you. Is there anything else about you that I didn't cover in the intro to the podcast?
Yeah, I think you covered the basics. I am a transracial adoptee and raised by white people and white culture. I recently had top surgery, and it was extremely affirming to my male identity, and it was honestly a great experience. I'm also a personal trainer, and I enjoy coaching people and helping people become their best selves. I just love to do what I can to elevate others, and so it's sort of full circle to be here today having this conversation with you.
Oh, I didn't remember that part of your journey, that you're a personal trainer and that you work to inspire other people to live their best lives. That makes this even more meaningful of a conversation for me.
Absolutely, it's mutual.
As you can see, Meridian does have lots of complexities that to add to this conversation, and I'm super excited to see how you weave in all of the intersectionalities of your identities. That there is a lot there, and I'm sure it's taught you a lot as you've lived your life.
It's taught me a lot. Absolutely. I mean, life is full of lessons, and I think my life isn't unique in any specific way, but it's definitely showed me how to become the person that I want to be. And I think at all the intersections that I represent, it just represents an opportunity to grow and continue to develop this person that I'm becoming. So I'm happy to share and tell the audience a little bit more.
That becoming the person you want to be, that's such an important thing I want to highlight just before we even get into this conversation, because so much of living in this world teaches us to be living based on other people's metrics and to be living based on what other people think we should be, what we should look like, how we should dress, how our gender expression should be, what our sexuality should be, what our jobs should be. And I love that you're already finding a place where it's about the man that you want to be and not anything else.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely been a journey. I remember being a kid and not really knowing how to get to where I thought I wanted to be as a kid, which turns out was exactly where I needed to be, having, sort of arrived there now, 30 some odd years later. But I feel like in my youth, I had a clear understanding of who I was. I just didn't know how to get there. And it wasn't due to, you know, people telling me I shouldn't be a certain way or couldn't be a certain way. It was just the environment that I was in led me to believe certain things about who I could be. And it was sort of like the options weren't available to me and things like that. And so, in finding those resources, it's helped me navigate how to arrive at this place. And it is hard to tune out other people's perceptions and what society tells us we should or shouldn't be. As a black person, that's been my entire life. So I wouldn't say it was new to me to be told, to not do something or not be a certain way or to show up a certain way. And that's part of being a transracial adoptee too. So it's sort of been this consistent curve of learning and life experience that I wouldn't change. Even though it's broken me a few times, I wouldn't change it. And um, I'm glad to be here today, confident in who I am and who I'm becoming, because I know it to be true, and I know the type of person that I want to be. And I think a lot of people that were around me helped shape me and guide me. But I also felt myself grow in my own confidence and willingness to sort of say, "No, that's not who I want to be," or "No, that's not a fit for me." That can be a fit for you, but that's not the route that I want to go. And so it's been nice to see that evolution internally and then be able to express it externally.
Hmm. Am I hearing you correctly that a lot of what you learned about what was possible for you or what you could be wasn't necessarily, the problems weren't necessarily that people were telling you what you couldn't be. It was actually that you just didn't see representation of what you could be?
You said that way more eloquently than I did. Yeah, you're hearing me correctly. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's an important distinction that even sometimes in really well-meaning families um, in good spaces, in good childhoods, we can still miss out on pieces of who we can become, who we want to become, because of missing representation. Just having our identities affirmed by being able to
Mm,
see that outside of ourselves.
right. Absolutely.
At least in my experience, I think that's, as queer people, we lose out on that a lot. We lose out on
Absolutely.
sort of that representation. And it sounds like you didn't even see you part of who you are as a black person in this world because you were around white people most of the time.
Right. It was interesting because I was acutely aware that I was not white.
It's hard to
But
hide that one.
right, but I was also like, wait a minute, where are all the other black people? Like,
Yeah.
where are they? And so, absolutely, I think you nail on the head with what you said before. And representation is huge. And in thinking back on my childhood, I didn't really have, as a sort of like my formative like queer years, I didn't really have a black mentor or person that I looked up to that I wanted to emulate. Um, I had athletes that I really liked and admired and things like that, but a lot of the characteristics that I was drawn to were by people in my circle who were white, and that's not to say that wasn't by choice, that just was. And so I became this person who chased characteristics to emulate and chased um, behaviors and attributes, and those became part of my core. It became less about my skin color. We can argue whether that's good or bad, but it became less about my skin color, more about the type of person, not the color of the person that I wanted.
So I heard you say that you kind of looked up to athletes at times and you looked up to certain people. When you were a young child and you were kind of internalizing stories about what manhood was or what it was to be masculine, can you share a little bit more about what those stories were or what are some of those lessons you learned as a kid?
Yeah, it was interesting because I don't have any brothers. The main man in my life was my dad. Is my dad. And a lot of what I knew about masculinity and being masculine stemmed from my father. And this is my adoptive father, not my biological father. And he is just this warm, gentle guy with good intentions, who always does whatever he can to help other people. And he became, I don't want to say role model, but he became someone that I just latched onto in terms of defining masculinity. I was like, this is what men are like. This is a man that I value. This is someone that I, really like and relate to and want to be like, because he was a perfect combination of like compassion and love and taking responsibility on himself to be the man in the family and to do the hard things and to be supportive and encouraging and all of that. So a lot of what I understood as masculinity came from him, but also when I looked up to athletes, it was a different type of energy. So I still am a huge Kobe Bryant fan. Rest in power, and it was a different type of energy. The Kobe Bryants and Michael Jordans of the world. That sort of like animal instinct and competitive nature was something that I also latched onto, and that turned out to get me a full ride scholarship in basketball. So it worked out, but I had two very different understandings of masculinity that I think I've tried to merge and meld together. Because, like you were saying before, there's merit to both, and I think there's merit to both sides and types and facets of masculinity as well.
And so, what's that process been like for you to be merging those two? What have you learned in that
I've
process?
learned I've learned that there's a time and a place for a competitive edge. I've learned
Has that gotten you in trouble sometimes?
here and there, yeah, for sure. But yeah, I think it's definitely about balance for me, and I've just been. It's been a joy to understand the depth and breadth of what masculinity can be and what it's meant for me and how I express that. And there's a certain tenderness that my dad has that I really try to bring to my marriage and everything that that entails. And still married, so I think it's going well. But then, in other parts of the world, I gotta, tap into the Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan and get a little competitive, and that serves in those places too. So I've learned that it's about balance and it's about sort of having a delicate touch to the wins and the wears of how I express it.
I love that you've had what it sounds to me like is you've had really powerful and healthy representation of balanced masculine energy. You've had been able to access sort of the driven, goal-oriented, competitive side that athletes oftentimes hold, but also the gentle, soft, compassionate version of a caring father, of a father that knows how to show up for his family. And you've got to find and weave your own version of that. And living life in your shoes, what else has that taught? Has your stories around masculinity changed over time?
I wouldn't say they've changed drastically. I would say they've evolved sort of in tandem with my life experience and the place of the world, the state of the world. I've grown to understand what it means to be a black man in this world. And I've also learned that being that person can also include some tenderness.
Mm.
And I think it demands it from where I sit in my experience. It demands that I be loving and tender and also extremely aware and protective of the people that I love and of myself, wherever I go, at whatever time of day. So I would say it's evolving. It's evolving into like a higher awareness and sort of refining itself in the spaces that I choose to occupy.
Is that a new exploration for you, this sort of around your identity as a black man in this world? I mean, obviously you've always been one, but is that a new or is that developing in a new way for you?
That's a good question. I wouldn't say it's. Here's the thing. So I have the privilege of passing, which I realize is a huge privilege. And it's funny looking at pictures of myself now and looking at pictures of myself even a year ago. I'm like, wow, people thought I was the guy then. What do they think I am now?
Can
But
you can
yeah,
you share a little bit more about what that means in terms of passing? Like you and I know what
sure.
that means, but not every one of my listeners is going to get that.
Sure. Yeah. So passing is, when someone sort of looks and fits the bill of what someone else would expect them to look like. So if you see someone who passes as a trans man, what that means for me is I have masculine features, maybe a more square face, facial hair, deeper voice. It's sort of being able to walk into a space and have your identity affirmed and not questioned. And I think a lot of times in my experience, it was questioned. And then people were informed, and then it was still questioned. So now I can walk into a space and there's no question. People say, yes, sir, thank you, sir. Sometimes they call me boss. I don't ever know why that's an okay thing. Like that's such an awkward. Like, don't say it. That's so weird. But it is a privilege to pass in public spaces, and I've been passing most of my life, which I'm extremely grateful for. And now, so I've always dealt with sort of being a black man in a space or a black person in a space I think now it's not as that different than it was a few years ago, honestly, because I have been passing. So I think in the way that it's a little bit more different now is the emotion and power behind all the racial social activism that's happening now and all of the black deaths in the community. I think the outside perception is a little bit different. I will say that over the past, I don't know, couple months, have seen a shift in my own community in the spaces that I occupy. When I go out on walks, go to the grocery store, people make eye contact and they smile, and that part is new. That part is new, and it's a welcome change. I think we got there on very very unfortunate terms, but I do see the shift, and I see the affirmations, and I see the accountability, and that honestly has meant a lot.
That's so fantastic to hear that in your actual lived experience, you're noticing people shift. You're noticing people show up and see you and try to see you, not just to see their story or to
Right.
see or try to avoid seeing you
Yeah.
in some ways.
Plenty of those years. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think the intersections of your identity, being a trans black man, but being just a black man, I think in many ways both of those identities could cause people to overlook you or to have a clear story about you that
Mm.
doesn't fit the narrative of their life.
Right. Absolutely.
I guess what I've seen in you, and I wanted to know if this feels true to you, but I have seen you stepping forward with a different level of your voice into the conversation, into sharing about your experiences or the experiences of your community in a different way since George Floyd's death and sort of this movement really started moving through in a bigger way. Is that
Hmm.
true?
Yeah, I would say that's true.
And what kinds of different conversations are you having now than you were having before?
Travis, let me tell you, I'm having all these conversations with all these kinds of people that I was not expecting to have in 2020. Let me just tell you. Oh my gosh. So let's see. So I'm a transracial adoptee. My adoptive family is white. And so what this has all meant for me is I've now been given permission to have conversations about race that I never felt I could have. Part of me never wanted to have the conversation, right? But the other part of me that's been woken up recently has permission and is like, okay, if you're going to have these conversations, you're going to have them now because this is the time. There's never going to be a better time to talk about this. It's been 30 some odd years. You need to do this. And it's forcing me to have conversations that are uncomfortable and hard and terrible. And, conversations with family members who disagree with either my lifestyle or, the things that I believe in, like Black Lives Matter. And it's shedding light on issues that to me are non-negotiable. And I'm having a deeper understanding of where people that are close to me stand. And it is hard. But ultimately, I know in my heart that this is the kind of change that I need to go through, and this is the kind of change that my family and people that are close to me need to go through as well. And I can't control the output. Absolutely can't control it. I can control my input, and I can control how and when and where and why I lead and I lean in and I step up. And having permission to do that, giving myself permission to do that, is turning out to be an extremely large blessing. And again, unexpected, but such is life.
Yeah, I mean, you're using language that has so much tie to not gender masculine, but like energetic masculine, like that
Mm,
stepping up, that leaning in, that knowing what's non-negotiable for you and stepping forward and sharing your perspective, taking up space, not
mm,
apologizing for doing so. Those are such masculine kind of energetics. And I really value that. And that's what something that I feel like you and I connect on is that's what I'm doing with this podcast is me taking up space and saying, here's my non-negotiables in the
mm,
relationships that I'm having, in the men that I invite into my life is that we're not going to do that power over dynamic stuff anymore. We're not going to do that invalidating the identities of other people. We're not doing that anymore. We're not we're not going to give lip service or just put a sign out in our front yard that says Black Lives Matter, but then still vote for people that allow crap like this to happen.
Right. Right. I love it. I mean, it's such a critical time, and it's. I couldn't agree with you more. I really feel like this is the time to have these conversations and do these things and hold people accountable. And challenge the narrative and challenge the old world narrative of masculinity and look at where that's gotten us. I mean, truly, there's a huge part of me that believes that evolution and growth are normal. It's normal. We are here to evolve our thought and our sense of self, and our place in our communities. And if we're not doing that, I don't know what else we're doing.
Yeah, totally. And I think that maybe this is a projection, so I'll just ask it as a question, but has your life not prepared you to be doing this kind of stuff? Like, sounds to me like, based on the intersectionality of your identities, it sounds like you probably have had to have challenging conversations multiple times in your life.
You'd think I would have seen it coming, to be honest. I mean, there were so many signs, so many signs. Yeah, I am starting to understand that's exactly what's been happening. And it's interesting because I've been resistant to it for a part of my life, and I think mostly when I identified as female and all of that, but also in just growing as a person and understanding where and how to apply myself. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, and I say that in a way that's like, recognize the signs, see where things are going, see what path you're on, pay attention, and it feels really good to be just in flow with it and not in resistance to it. I think for me, there's a lot of freedom that comes with being graceful enough to go down the path that you're being led on.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it does seem like all the signs are pointing that way in your life, and I'm sort of proud to sort of look at you and see that ownership of what of what your life is about and where you're meant to be. I mean, you and I met several years ago while you were working for an LGBT Chambers of Commerce and a scholarship fund, and doing work that was about advocating for marginalized people, anyways.
Hmm.
And now I think in some ways it's been preparing you to be able to step forward and take up space and have really challenging conversations about what's non-negotiable with people.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Um, yeah, it's sort of like just being teed up every so often and just getting ready for the next thing. And I'm trying to absorb as much as I can in all of those spaces and say, okay, here's what I'm learning, here's what I can take with me and put into practice, and then where does that take me? And it's been a blessing, and it's been a really exciting journey.
Yeah. Well, I'm really curious to know, as a white man myself, I don't really know that I'll ever have the true empathetic experience of what it's like to be a black man in this world. I can ask questions, I can be curious, I can be sympathetic, I can relate it to my own otherizedness in this world, but I'll never know what that actual experience is like. And you've had to negotiate both the white world and the black world at different times of your life, and sometimes at the same time. Can you share with me what you know of or what comes to mind when you think of the differences between what masculinity is as a white man versus what masculinity is as a black man?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so I think it's sort of obviously like masculinity, and I apologize if this is a projection, but masculinity as a white man, I think, includes a certain level of privilege and access and all of those things that just creates a different experience. I mean, it's a very different experience, and I think masculinity as a black man it's sort of like if someone were to throw out eggshells in every space that you entered, and then they tried to chase you and said, "Don't step on the eggshells. Don't step on the eggshells." That's kind of what it feels like to be a black man now. I think a little bit of that is true too of years in the past where we can't get super upset about anything. Can't we're very have to be very careful with our emotions, and how they're expressed. And I think that's where the injection of sort of like tenderness comes to play in my experience. I try to be level-headed and tender in the right places and all of that. So for me, I've found that people expect me to do things or not do things based on being black, and they think that they can speak to me a certain way or treat me a certain way, and it's very obvious. And navigating that is tough. What's kind of hilarious is talking to people on the phone. I don't really sound black, and so when they meet me in person, they're kind of like, "Wow, wait, what's your name again?" And it just creates a totally different experience. So I think perception and biases and all of those things come into play, and I just think they're two very different worlds.
That's really interesting because in some ways, I heard you say earlier around being passable, that it's a privilege for you in terms of your gender identity and gender expression.
Mm-hmm.
And in this way, in this world, in some ways, your voice is passable to the majority, to those who have power, white folk.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when people meet you, you can't pass.
Right. Certainly can't pass as white in person, but it's like it's such a weird assumption, and weird isn't even the right word, but it's just like
I think you can go a step further than weird.
I could.
It's
Here's that
not
tenderness,
okay.
though. Here's that tenderness.
Here's a non-negotiable.
Yeah.
The assumption that whiteness is what you should be wanting to pass as is just, it's one of those systemic things that we're talking about as a culture.
Right.
That there is an assumption based on a lot of people's minds that, oh, it would be good that you can sound white on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that better? Why is that good?
Yeah, listen, systemic racism is real, folks.
It is.
And it is projected in ways that sometimes people don't see themselves doing it. And it's such a weird, inappropriate thing to have to experience. I literally was on the phone with someone the other day, and they said, "Wow, surprised to hear your voice." And I was like, I don't know what that means. What do you mean? Like, what do you mean by that? What does that even mean? And this person was like, "Oh, no, you're just very articulate. And honestly, I'm surprised to hear a man's voice." And so just like, I feel like those are things that just you don't need to say.
Yeah, I think that's important. I'm glad you brought that up because I would assume, maybe it's a bad assumption, but I would assume most of the people who are listening to this podcast are really well-intentioned people who don't intend to be racist, who don't intend to make assumptions that are actually quite obnoxious, painful, rude. We can say lots of different words. But well-intentions are just not enough. We do have to educate ourselves on these ways in which our mind is trained to think in certain ways, to assume male is better than female, then to assume white is better than black. We have to really challenge those pieces and start looking at what actual equality means, and not what our mind tells us, or our well-intended mind tells us equality is.
Right. That's a great point. And, you made me think of something that I heard. I can't remember where I heard it, but intent versus impact. And so whether you're intending to come off a certain way or say something a certain way, look at the impact that it has on the person you're speaking to. Oftentimes when those things are different, there's some conflict there. And it's not so much about what your intention was as it is about how it was received by that person. And that makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I think that's what, to me, something that's infused in the new masculine is your intention does matter. It's not that your well intentions are not important and don't matter, but I want to encourage men to also look at the impact that it has, the impact of their behaviors, the impact they have on the external environment. We as men are not taught very well empathy. We have the cognitive ability to do empathy, but we don't actually express empathy very well. And we don't actually deal with our uncomfortable feelings when we empathize with another very well. And sort of being able to sit in that tension and notice the impact you've had on somebody else, and actually caring that you've made a challenging impact is an important aspect I want to encourage the men listening to this podcast to really look at, and just the people listening to this podcast to really look at.
Absolutely.
Something you also shared that I think is important that I wanted to highlight was you talked about sort of as a Black man, you have to be more careful with your emotions. That carefulness or that sort of suppression of that you're not allowed to let emotions peak or jump. Is that, in your experience, is that both on the like sort of anger intensity side of things, but also like the emotional, vulnerable, tender?
My initial response is going to be the first part of what you said, when the anger and high energy side, but I do think it's both. I think society suppresses both. And what a disappointment. You know what I mean? Almost like, how dare you tell me how to feel and how much to feel and when to feel it? We're humans. We have emotions and peaks and valleys and all of it. And something I'm really grateful for is the ability to experience those things and understand where the inflection point of suppression is, and sit with that and ask myself, why do I feel like I can't say or do or be or whatever the case may be in this instance? And why is that? And every time it comes up, just challenge it, with the goal of trying to undo it. I think society is really good about telling men to not show emotions, not be emotional, definitely never cry. I've cried twice in the past 3 days, and let me just tell you, it's okay. You do survive it, and you're a little bit better for it.
It actually makes you feel better most of the time
Yeah,
afterwards.
absolutely. So I think it's just really challenging to sort of do the dance between the emotional peaks, so to speak. But again, going back to what I said before, it really is about balance and being able to feel your feelings in full, and that's sort of your human right. But society will tell us otherwise.
It's really interesting. I'd never really thought about that. We as men, and just in general, take our race, our color, our anything, just take that out of the equation. Just men in general are taught to suppress their emotions, except anger. For white men, white men are allowed to express their anger. But now I'm noticing like there's another pressure point of another layer of pressure that gets put on a Black man that says not even the anger, not any emotion.
Right, because then you become a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think before that, before you're angry, you're a threat. But
For
how dare you be in a
sure.
space and also be upset? That's you're asking for a problem.
Yeah, and I think that's important to notice. I think it's important for the listeners to hear is that we've been talking on episodes before about the pressure that's on men to not express emotions, to actually suppress, especially the vulnerable and caring side of the emotions,
Hmm.
or the vulnerability, the sadness, the grief, depression, any of those things. Push that down, but to also notice that we put another layer of pressure on different kinds of men out there based on the way they look.
Absolutely agree. And we should not be doing that to each other. As men, I think we can hold each other accountable, and create space for a full range of emotions and expression. I think that's maybe where we become our best selves and our fullest selves, by letting ourselves experience the depth and breadth of all of our emotions without conflict.
I totally agree. Do you have any thoughts on how we do that with each other? How we bring that accountability piece that holds each other accountable, but then also leaves space for the sad, grieving, emotional selves that have not been allowed to feel for a long time?
Yeah, I think it starts with something you said earlier. So just listening and sort of paying attention to the people that we're around, um, and letting them know. I did this with someone the other day. I was like, "Hey, I understand that this is a really tough, challenging time. There's a lot of pain in this experience. You can always come to me. I'm always here. Love you, support you, that type of thing." So creating space, but not asking for them to share emotions that maybe they haven't processed yet, but just letting them know that you're there whenever they need you. If they never need you, they still know that you're there. And if they do end up needing you, then they know exactly where to go, and they're not going to be questioned. I think there's a lot to be said for shared trauma and shared experiences, and having conversations around things that are difficult, like this conversation. Creating space to understand each other, being interested enough to understand each other, because you never know. I think in cases, I've discovered that people have things in common with me that I never would have known about, and it just took being interested. And then you have this space and this bond where you have a bad day, something goes wrong that you weren't expecting, someone passes away, you know who you can go to. And you don't have to explain yourself. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and it sounds to me like there's one layer of that that feels really, it's we can let it be as simple as that. And yet, I think something that's important to notice is that in doing that, in creating space and caring for another and offering and being vulnerable with someone else, that's actually breaking the social construct of what masculinity is in our country, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does feel like a threat to men. It does
Yeah.
feel like their whole masculinity is in question. I think one of the previous guests that I had on the podcast talked about how masculinity in our culture is really often basically just the rejection of femininity. It is
Mm-hmm.
the opposite of
Mm-hmm.
female. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you do dip into that vulnerability, it breaks the social contract that we have agreed to, willingly or not willingly,
Right.
to reject the feminine and to push away all of those things. And so I want it to be as simple as what you were saying. And I also want to encourage men that it's okay if it doesn't feel that simple, because we also, in doing so, you are breaking all the rules of the socialization that was taught to you,
Mm-hmm.
but keep going anyways.
Right. Push through. Push through. Yeah. I think you can start small, like almost everything else, right?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, one step at a time. It doesn't have to be the whole thing all at once.
right.
And so let's add the next layer of it to it, where that's men that are sort of in the same proximity or are not too far away from you in terms of their life experience and where they're at. But what about one, especially I think this is important to talk about because of where we are as a culture and the conversations that are happening. What about when harm has been done? How do we participate in that dialogue? So for me as a queer person, as a gay person in this world, some men have violated that and caused pain and trauma and harm and made me feel less than and actively degraded me as a man. Or as you as a black man, I'm sure you have that experience too, where you have been minimized and belittled, or they perceived harm based on the stories in their head, and then they harmed you as a result of it. How do we participate with men like that around the accountability and the shifting the way we show up with each other? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. I think for me, what I try to do, I try to give a little grace. I mean, I think in the instances and experiences I've had, people that act that way are coming from a point of insecurity and lack of knowledge and understanding. And while understanding that it's not my job or desire to educate them, sometimes the pain that they have is obvious. And I can meet it with grace or I can meet it with frustration and anger. And what is going to be better for me? Probably meeting it with grace. And that doesn't mean I don't get upset. That doesn't mean I don't get bothered. Doesn't mean I don't get hurt. Of course, I get all of those things, right? But in my experience, I've found it's better to be gracious and sort of turn the other cheek, so to speak, and go high.
When they go low, we go
um,
high, that kind of concept. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Instead of sort of stooping and meeting them at their level. Because anytime I've done that, I've either left upset, hurt, even more frustrated than I was before, and there's no resolution. At least if I decide to go into this and express grace and leave with grace, then I know that they didn't win. I won. And I am a very competitive person. so so it's like okay, all right, you're gonna come at me with all this noise and mess, and I'm gonna smile at you, probably not say a word, maybe walk away, but I'm definitely not gonna let you get into my core and break my
Oh, I
spirit.
love that, because what I hear in that is that you're redefining what winning is. We can easily think, or our egos and our sort of pain points can make us think that winning is being louder and dominating. And yet that is just what we're actually trying to transform in this conversation, where we're just trying to have power over with each other and we just lock horns like an animal in the wild. And yet
Mm-hmm.
you're transforming that to actually redefine what power and winning is, so that you can stay in your own integrity, in your own value system. And as you were
Yeah.
saying in the beginning, be the man that you want to be, not the man that somebody else thinks you should be.
Not someone else that they think that I should be or that they're baiting me to try and be. Um, you can't drag me into your frustration. That's for you to deal with. You know, if you're going to project at me, that's fine. I don't have to absorb it. I don't have to invest in it. That's a reflection of you, not of me. And I'm choosing to address it with
Yeah,
grace.
it matches one of my favorite sayings that I say with some of my clients, and I've used in my own life is just because that other person is losing themselves does not mean I got to lose myself. I don't need to synchronize with their energy. I'm going to hold center where I'm at. And they can come join me or they can stay away. And I think you were saying, like, it doesn't mean that I don't get angry. It doesn't mean that I don't get hurt in the process. And I also think it's important to acknowledge it doesn't also mean that you don't get to have boundaries. As you were saying, as you're talking with
Right.
people recently, you're saying there are some non negotiables. There are some lines that we cannot cross and still stay in relationship or still stay in this type of relationship. There will be a lot more space between us. And I think that's important to
Hmm.
acknowledge too, that just because we're trying to do some of the repair work and transformation work around masculinity, that we just absorb all the garbage. We
Right.
still get to have
Right.
boundaries on our space too, and say what is allowed in our space.
Right. Exactly.
I so appreciate that. It sounds like you have really been learning a lot as you stepped forward and have started having conversations in bigger ways. Have you known this for a long time, or has this been just recent awarenesses that you're having?
Um, I think I've. If you ask my mom, she would say, "I was teaching you this all your life," and I'd be like, "Yeah, you're not wrong." But I didn't think I really understood it until recently. Um, but it was something that was part of my upbringing, and I'm so grateful for that because it has allowed me to process it for years and years and years, and now I can put it into practice and fully understand what it means to stand in my grace and have my boundaries and hold my own power. And these bigger conversations, sort of like I mentioned before, have refined that process for me, which has been great to see and feel and sort of live in. And it's starting to mean more to me. And I'm starting to value it more because if nobody can take your power, then I mean you're pretty much good.
I'm so impressed by the level of integration I can feel from you and just your language and the way that you share with yourself and the way you own these processes. Like it feels like you've been practicing them a lifetime.
Oh, thank you.
And I think right now, so many people are in that sort of fragmented, disrupted state because of a global pandemic, plus these bigger conversations on race and racism in the US, and having politicians that really stoke the division and that inflame the tension. And I think it can be so easy to be really fragmented right now and to be really out of your power. And it makes sense. I'm a life coach. I'm working with a lot of clients that are feeling that way, and that there's no shame in that. But I also really want to sort of give you a ton of props and celebrate where your level of integration is, because I think you articulate things so well, and it is clear that you have a grounded sense of who you are that is informed by the external conversation that's gone on, but not controlled by it.
Thank you. Yeah. I really appreciate that. And don't get me wrong, I did have a breaking point during this pandemic. But it made me reflective and it made me recount, you know, what is important and where I wanted to be and who I wanted to be and who I have been. And it got me back to ground level. It brought me back. And so you're catching me at a good time.
Yeah, I've had my own peaks and valleys in this pandemic too. And living 3 blocks from the big
Oh, yeah.
protest that's going on in Seattle, or that was going on, like it's a lot of energy around all
Hmm.
the time. There's a lot of big energy for an empath to be taking on all the time. I think one last thing that I want to draw you out on is, as you were saying, that you have had some crashes that have been a part of this. what are your self-care practices that help build you back up to ground level? Because I think that's something we as men are not very good at, is having self-care practices to know that the crashes are going to happen, but what are the ways that we walk ourselves back to ground and that we walk ourselves back into our power and into our space?
Yeah. So therapy has been a blessing.
Mm.
I've just recently this year started working with therapists, and mental health is real, and it should be a priority. At least for me, it's a priority now, and I think that that has really contributed to a lot of these conversations being deeper and sort of more meaningful, and a clarity of thought that I desperately needed when sort of everything was coming to a head. So mental health, practicing, good mental health, finding people that root for you. Like, we hear that we're the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. Who do you spend time with? Are they rooting for you, or are they like, oh, you're doing that again? Well, we'll see how that goes. Find people that root for you and cheer for you, and you know will go all out for you. So I try to surround myself with really good people, um, who have shared values, who also push me to be better, um, who encourage me doing more of the things that I love. I shockingly now, I hate to even say it because I did not think I'd be this person. But when the gyms closed, I started running. So I'm a runner and
Oh,
doing
wow.
things. This is from a high school sprinter when 200 meters was the farthest I could probably go. But finding hobbies and things that are enjoyable, doing the things that make you smile, right? Just really prioritizing what makes you feel good, and that's been a learning for me because I used to think, oh, self care, I don't even know what that means. I'm not going to spend any time on it. Um, but then when all of the things that you like to do or you think you like to do sort of get stripped down and taken away, again, I went back to zero and was like, okay, what am I interested in? What do I like? There's a point in my life when people are like, what do you do in your free time? And I didn't have any free time. And I was like, I don't know. Nothing. I don't do anything because I don't have any free time. But I was forced to explore the things that I used to really enjoy, drawing, sports, being active, having great conversations with people that push me and challenge and elevate me. I'm big on reflection and sort of like self-analysis, and looking at different parts of my life that have been good and have been hard and have been bad, and why were they that way? What did I learn? So I try to be in this constant state of like growth and reflection, and that has stopped me from looking for answers outwardly and expecting things of the world, and realizing that I can do things to create an environment that I feel really good about and feel really good in, and attract things into my life that make me a better person. So,
Yeah, you talked about that earlier on too. That sort of self inquiry piece, asking
mm,
yourself a lot of why questions, asking yourself what it is, what did I learn from it, and I love that you do that in such a self appreciative way. It's like appreciative self inquiry. It's what
mhm,
did I learn? How did I grow? How did I get through that really challenging point? It's helping you instead of looking at yourself and the failures. It's looking at how did I navigate through? What are my strengths? What are the places that what are the things I can call on in myself that helped me move through those pieces? And I love that there's that internal piece that's you, but I also think it's important to highlight that several of the things you talked about are about relationship with others.
mhm,
And I think we as men can sometimes feel like it's our job to move through it by ourselves on our own.
mm,
And you
mhm.
ask for help with a therapist, you receive that support from somebody that has some wisdom to share with you, that has some ability to support you in a way that helps you grow, but also the people around you that are just who you spend your time with that build you up.
Yeah,
That you're not an isolated island out there having to figure it out by yourself, that you have support system around you and connection on top of that ability to look inward.
yeah. I mean, it's almost like if someone throws you an oar and you're in a sinking boat, you grab the oar, you take it, or you hop in their boat. But it's about. I found it to be helpful to really understand where my resources are and how to tap into those, and have no shame in that. And it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to be vulnerable and not have all the answers. I mean, that's why the people that you surround yourself with are so important. They're there for you no matter what.
Beautiful. So if you were going to give one piece of advice that either synthesizes what we've talked about today or just something that you really hold on to for your life, what would that piece of advice be?
I would say challenge your own ideals of masculinity and see where maybe you can evolve. Look at the people around you and the people in your circles. Um, they love you and they need us. They want to be there for us. The best way that they can show up for us is if we're our best selves, and that takes that self reflection. And we have to challenge those truths every day and say, why is this the definition of masculinity that I have? How is that impacting the people around me? Is that making me a better person? If the answers to those questions are often no, how do we change that? Where do we want to get to? Take some ownership of your own definition of masculinity and make sure that it fits the type of man you want to be.
Oh, love it. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing your story with me and with the listeners. An important value that I think is coming through during all of this time of tension is elevating voices that haven't been heard before. And I really thank you for being brave enough to sort of jump into this with me and to deepen our relationship through this conversation. So I really appreciate that. Something I know that's common between us is we both are really interested in benefiting our communities and benefiting communities that need support. As a way of doing that for my podcast, what I'm gonna plan to do is I'm gonna be setting up a Patreon for this podcast where people can sort of donate money and give money to the New Masculine as a way of showing gratitude, as a way of paying it forward with the content that I'm creating on this podcast, and to sort of fuel the movement that I'm creating here with this podcast. But I also want I want to pay it forward and give back in that as well. And so the idea that I have right now is to in the first month of the Patreon being open, and it'll be open when your episode launches later on in July, is to give 25% of anything that's put into that Patreon to organizations that are important to you. And so I asked you beforehand if you had any. Do you have any that you'd like to bring forward as organizations that we can be donating to?
Yeah, there's a few organizations that come to mind. So one, Justice for Breonna Taylor. There's a GoFundMe page set up
Say
for
her
that.
name.
Say her name over and over and over. Justice for Breonna Taylor. The Elijah McClain Memorial Fund is another great one. And I Run with Maud. I think for the trans organizations, there's a ton of them, but a lot of these deal with supporting lives that are lost, and community resources, mental health, meals, legal services, all those types of things. The Okra Project is a great one. They do meals to Black trans people and support mental health and recovery. The Lavender Rights Project, they provide low-cost legal services and community programming. And then the Trans Women of Color Collective is another one.
I'm so glad that you brought a couple of different vantage points of how to support Black folks in the world. And I think for some of the listeners that are listening who don't have their experiences have a lot of immersion in the challenges that Black folks are facing, but also the challenges that Black trans folk are facing. I think Black trans folk are often the most marginalized and are having some of the worst health crises, the worst death rates, the worst abuse rates, and are left out in a lot of ways. And so if we can be supporting Black trans lives as well as all Black lives, I think that's a really important thing. So thank you for bringing that forward. And again, as this episode goes live on July 20th, 2020, 25% of all contributions made in the first month to this Patreon's podcast will go to the organizations that Meridian has recommended. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and these organizations, please go to patreon.com/thenewmasculine. Again, that's patreon.com/thenewmasculine to make your contribution. I'll also, in the show notes, I'll link to all of those organizations' websites so that you can go directly to there to donate as well. So I'm so appreciative of any donations and any money that is given towards these things, and any that is given towards me to help me continue building this movement that I'm doing with the New Masculine. So Meridian, if people wanted to connect with you beyond just this episode, how might they do so?
Yeah, they can reach me via email. My email is meridianmayer@gmail.com. pretty straightforward. meridianmayer@gmail.com.
I know our gyms are closed right now, but as a personal trainer, are you accepting new clients?
I am accepting new clients, and the same email applies.
Great. Yeah. So if you're interested in Meridian, his story, as well as in the work he's doing in the world, please do reach out to him. If you're interested in connecting with me, you can go to my Instagram at Travers03. It's a little bit of my personal life as well as my business and some of this new masculine stuff. I really value having this conversation be an active conversation, not just one that is just static on these episodes. So social media is a really great place to participate in the dialogue, to comment, to continue sharing with me your perspective on where the new masculine is going, what are your values that add to this new masculine, and to also be in community with other men that are really interested in this. So again, that's at Travers03 on Instagram. You can go to my website at travisstock.com, or you can email me at travisstock03@gmail.com. I really appreciate, Meridian, you joining me for this podcast and allowing me to elevate your voice and share your story on this podcast. Thank you for being the man that you are and for modeling so much integration and power and compassion and gentleness that most men need to sort of model themselves after you. So thank you for being a beacon of that